The fluorescent lights hum in the underground bunkers beneath Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters. It's 8:30 a.m., August 6, 1945. The humid summer air carries the weight of a nation at war for nearly 4 years. Staff officers in sweat-stained khaki uniforms bend over communication boards, plotting pins on massive wall maps that show the shrinking perimeter of the Japanese Empire. General Korechika Anami, Japan's war minister, strides through the corridors with the bearing of a career soldier who has never known defeat. At 58, his weathered face carries the confidence of a man who believes absolutely in Japan's divine destiny. The morning briefing should be routine. Overnight reports from garrison commanders across the home islands. Updates on the massive Ketsugo defense preparations designed to make any American invasion so costly that the enemy would sue for peace. But something is wrong. The communication board for the Chugoku Military District shows nothing. No morning reports from Hiroshima's 2nd General Army Headquarters. No updates from the 400,000 civilians and military personnel in Japan's 8th largest city. The operators twist their radio dials, hearing only static where there should be the familiar crackle of field reports. "Sir?" A young communications officer stammers, sweat beading on his forehead despite the underground cool. "We've lost all contact with Hiroshima. All military frequencies, all civilian radio. Everything went silent at approximately 8:15 this morning." Anami's dark eyes narrow. In 4 years of total war, entire cities don't simply vanish from the communication grid. Not cities with major military headquarters. Not cities that were just hours ago reporting normal defensive preparations. What force on earth could instantly silence 340,000 people? You have to understand the mindset of these 6 men who controlled Japan's fate in August 1945. They called themselves the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, the Big Six, and they genuinely believed they held the keys to victory, even as American B-29s turned their cities to ash night after night. General Korechika Anami, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, General Yoshijiro Umezu, Prime Minister Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai. 6 men, 70 million lives hanging in the balance. But here's what made them so dangerously confident. They knew secrets the Americans couldn't possibly imagine. Since 1940, Japan had been racing to build its own atomic bomb. 2 separate programs, the Army's NIGO project under Dr. Yoshio Nishina, and the Navy's FGO project under Dr. Bunsaku Arakatsu. These weren't amateur efforts cobbled together by desperate scientists in basement laboratories. Nishina was one of the world's leading nuclear physicists, a man who had worked with Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, who co-authored the Klein-Nishina formula that described how gamma rays scatter off electrons, who understood the theoretical foundations of atomic fission better than almost anyone alive. He had built Japan's first cyclotron in 1936, the second in the world after America's. By 1941, his laboratory at the Riken Institute employed over 100 researchers working on 5 specific research themes: atomic bomb theory, separation of uranium-235, production of uranium hexafluoride, measurement of physical constants, and analysis of isotopes. And that knowledge had taught him something crucial. Building atomic bombs was virtually impossible. The uranium enrichment alone required industrial facilities beyond imagination. Massive electromagnetic separation plants, thousands of tons of uranium ore, electrical power consumption that would drain entire regions. Japan's leading scientists had calculated every variable, run every equation, examined every technical requirement. Even the mighty United States, with its untouched industrial base, could produce perhaps 1 or 2 atomic weapons at most. Maybe 3 if they had started earlier than anyone suspected. This was the prison of expertise. When the morning reports began filtering in, scattered, contradictory, barely believable, the military leaders dismissed them with the confidence of men who possessed superior knowledge. A small number of B-29s attacked Hiroshima with a nude-type bomb, read the first coherent report from a reconnaissance plane. Considerable damage observed. Admiral Toyota barely looked up from his strategic maps. Considerable damage from a few bombers? He had survived the massive B-29 raids that had already destroyed 42 major Japanese cities. Probably a concentrated incendiary attack, he declared. It's getting more efficient. But as the hours passed, the reports grew stranger. Train schedules to Hiroshima had been indefinitely suspended. Military communications remained completely severed. Most unsettling of all, a Radiance plane reported seeing something unprecedented. A mushroom-shaped cloud rising nearly 40,000 feet into the sky. Then came President Truman's radio announcement, transmitted by shortwave and picked up by Japanese monitors. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped 1 bomb on Hiroshima, an important Japanese army base. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It is an atomic bomb. The silence in the Supreme War Council meeting room was deafening. General Anami finally spoke, his voice carrying the studied calm of a career military officer. The Americans are engaged in psychological warfare. Even if they have developed some form of atomic device, the technical requirements make mass production impossible. Our own research confirms this. Toyota nodded grimly. If the Americans possessed an arsenal of such weapons, they would have used them months ago. This is clearly a desperate gambit, perhaps their only such device. What they couldn't know was that their scientific expertise had become their greatest weakness. Their atomic research had taught them exactly how difficult the task was, but it had also blinded them to American industrial capabilities they couldn't fathom. The Manhattan Project had employed over 130,000 workers across multiple states. It consumed more electricity than entire nations. It represented the largest secret industrial undertaking in human history. The Japanese military leaders were making decisions based on what they knew was possible, but they were fighting an enemy that had redefined the possible itself.
Nishina's journey into hell. Dr. Yoshio Nishina had seen the theoretical calculations. He understood better than almost any human being alive what an atomic bomb could do in theory. But theory and reality are separated by a chasm that can only be crossed through direct experience. On August 7, 1945, Nishina crossed that chasm. The train journey from Tokyo to the ruins of Hiroshima took 11 hours through a landscape that seemed increasingly surreal. For miles before reaching the city, Nishina could see trees stripped of leaves, telephone poles snapped like matchsticks, and a strange, acrid smell that burned his nostrils. Then the train stopped. The tracks ahead had been twisted into impossible spirals by forces that defied comprehension. Nishina walked the final 5 miles into what had been Hiroshima. Nothing, absolutely nothing had prepared him for what he found. Buildings hadn't just collapsed, they had been vaporized. Human shadows were burned permanently into concrete walls, the ghostly outlines of people who had been walking to work when 8:15 a.m. became the last moment they would ever experience. The hypocenter, where the bomb had detonated 1,900 feet above ground, was a perfect circle of absolute destruction extending for miles in every direction. Between 60,000 and 80,000 people died instantly. The heat from the bomb was so intense that some people simply vanished in the explosion, their bodies converted to atomic vapor before their nervous systems could register pain. But most haunting of all were the survivors. Nishina, a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of scientific knowledge, found himself face to face with radiation sickness, a phenomenon that existed only in theoretical physics papers until that moment. Victims whose skin was literally falling off their bodies, people vomiting blood, hair falling out in clumps. The walking dead, stumbling through ruins that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Nishina's hands trembled as he took measurements with his Geiger counter, the clicking growing frantic as he approached ground zero. This wasn't just an explosive device. This was the fundamental forces of the universe unleashed on a human city. Everything he thought he knew about the limits of atomic weapons had been utterly, catastrophically wrong. The Manhattan Project, America's impossible achievement. While Nishina walked through radioactive ruins, trying to comprehend the impossible made real, the truth about American capabilities remained hidden behind layers of wartime secrecy. What the Japanese military leadership couldn't imagine, what their scientific expertise prevented them from believing, was the sheer scale of American industrial mobilization. The Manhattan Project began with a single letter in 1939. Albert Einstein, Leo Szilard, and other refugee physicists from Nazi-occupied Europe warned President Roosevelt that Hitler might be developing atomic weapons. By 1942, the project was transferred to the Army Corps of Engineers under Colonel Leslie Groves, who was promoted to brigadier general specifically for this assignment. Groves was not a scientist, he was a builder, the man who had just completed construction of the Pentagon. He understood something that Japanese physicists, for all their brilliance, could not. American industrial capacity operated on a scale that transcended normal engineering constraints. The numbers tell a story of industrial mobilization that defies comprehension. 130,000 workers at peak employment, equivalent to the entire U.S. automobile industry at the time. $2 billion spent, equivalent to $35.4 billion today, with over 90% devoted to building factories and production facilities. 3 massive secret cities constructed from scratch: Los Alamos in New Mexico for research and design, Oak Ridge in Tennessee for uranium enrichment, and Hanford in Washington for plutonium production. Oak Ridge became the 5th largest city in Tennessee almost overnight. Its electromagnetic separation plant, the Y-12 facility, was so large that workers rode bicycles between workstations inside the building. The K-25 gaseous diffusion plant became the largest building under one roof in the world at that time, covering 44 acres. Hanford operated a fleet of over 900 buses, more than the city of Chicago. At its peak, the construction camp was the 3rd most populous town in Washington state. The federal government relocated 1,500 residents and displaced the Bonapum and other tribes to create a 430,000-acre exclusion zone. Oak Ridge consumed more electric power than entire nations. The uranium enrichment process required such staggering amounts of electricity that the Tennessee Valley Authority built new power plants specifically for the project. Security was so compartmentalized that most workers had no idea they were building atomic weapons. Technicians operated equipment without knowing what it produced. Engineers designed components without understanding the final assembly. Even the wives of scientists living in Los Alamos didn't know what their husbands were creating. The project brought together an unprecedented concentration of scientific genius. J. Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, Niels Bohr, Richard Feynman, Edward Teller, Leo Szilard, Nobel laureates and future Nobel laureates working alongside recent graduates and practical engineers. It was a collaboration between theoretical physicists who understood the cosmic forces at play and practical engineers who could build the impossible. Two different bomb designs emerged. Little Boy used enriched uranium-235 in a gun-type assembly, literally firing one subcritical mass into another to achieve critical mass. Fat Man used plutonium-239 in an implosion design, surrounding a plutonium core with conventional explosives that compressed it to supercritical density. The first test, codenamed Trinity, occurred on July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert. The explosion produced a flash of light visible 200 miles away and a mushroom cloud that rose 40,000 feet into the atmosphere. Oppenheimer, watching his creation transform theoretical physics into apocalyptic reality, recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." 3 weeks later, Little Boy was loaded aboard the USS Indianapolis and shipped to Tinian Island in the Marianas. The components for Fat Man followed by air. Japanese scientists had calculated correctly that building such weapons required industrial capabilities beyond normal comprehension. What they failed to imagine was that America had exceeded normal comprehension. Nagasaki, the second blow. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council was finally meeting to discuss the Hiroshima reports. It was the morning of August 9th, 3 days after the first bomb. They had learned of Soviet entry into the war during the night, with massive Red Army forces pouring into Manchuria. During the meeting, an aide burst into the conference room. "Nagasaki has been attacked with another atomic bomb." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Admiral Toyoda's pen clattering to the mahogany table. Another bomb, just 3 days later. At 11:02 a.m., the B-29 Boxcar had released Fat Man, a plutonium implosion device weighing 10,000 pounds. The bomb detonated at an altitude of 1,650 feet, with a yield of 21 kilotons, 40% more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Estimated 35,000 to 40,000 people died instantly. The heat from the bomb was so intense that some people simply vanished in the explosion, their bodies converted to atomic vapor before their nervous systems could register pain. But most haunting of all were the survivors. To the men in Tokyo, geography was irrelevant. What mattered was the terrifying implication if the Americans had 2 bombs. They could have 3 or 10 or 100. In that moment, every assumption the Japanese military leadership had hung on to disintegrated like paper in flames. The entire foundation of Japan's defensive strategy, Operation Ketsugo, the plan to bleed the Americans so severely during the invasion that they would negotiate peace, had just become meaningless. Why would America invade when they could simply erase Japanese cities from existence, one by one, until nothing remained but radioactive wasteland? For the first time in the war, harage, stomach art, the Japanese cultural practice of reaching consensus through unspoken understanding, failed them completely.
The Big Six debated for hours. Before them was the Potsdam Declaration, setting forth Allied conditions for ending the war. The Council had to respond, but they were fundamentally, irreconcilably divided.
3 members advocated accepting the Potsdam Declaration with one condition: preservation of the imperial institution. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, Prime Minister Kontaro Suzuki, and Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, the peace faction, argued that further resistance was suicide. 3 members demanded 4 conditions. Japan would disarm its own forces, no foreign occupation forces supervising disarmament. Japan would conduct its own war crimes trials, no allied tribunals, no occupation of Japan, retention of the emperor and imperial system. Army Minister General Kodachika Anami, Army Chief of Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Admiral Soemu Toyoda, the war continuation faction, refused to surrender without these guarantees. Under the Japanese governing system, the Big Six could only act when unanimous. With a 3-3 split, they were deadlocked. Hours passed in heated discussion with no consensus on the horizon. The full cabinet met at 2:30 p.m. and spent most of the day debating surrender, arriving at the same 3-3 split. A second cabinet meeting lasted from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., again ending with no consensus. Japan's harmonic unity, the cultural foundation of their entire decision-making system, had been shattered. The tectonic plates of faction had churned the waters. But even faced with this apocalyptic reality, General Anami couldn't surrender his vision of honorable death over dishonored survival. "Would it not be wondrous," he asked during the cabinet debates, his voice carrying an eerie poetry, "for this whole nation to be destroyed like a beautiful flower?" The other members of the council stared at him in stunned silence. Here was a man so committed to the warrior's code that he would choose national extinction over national surrender. In his mind, there was something pure, something aesthetically perfect about Japan disappearing in atomic fire rather than bowing before foreign occupiers. Reality was about to intrude in the most devastating and absurdly possible way. On August 8, 1945, just 2 days after Hiroshima and 1 day before Nagasaki, a P-51 Mustang fighter pilot named Marcus Elma McDilda was shot down over Japan during a strafing run. McDilda was 24 years old, from Albemarle, North Carolina. He was a conventional fighter pilot, a good pilot, but nothing special. He had never been briefed on atomic weapons. He knew absolutely nothing about the Manhattan Project, atomic physics, or bomb design. He knew only that he had been shot down, captured, and was now in the hands of the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police. The Kempeitai interrogators began with routine questions about his aircraft, his base, American fighter capabilities. McDilda tried to resist, lying about aircraft performance, claiming there were 300 fighters at his home base when there were actually only 150. Then the interrogators showed him aerial photographs proving he was lying. The beatings intensified. For hours, the Japanese repeated the same pattern: questions, answers, beatings when they detected lies. McDilda was exhausted, terrified, and in excruciating pain. Then the officer in charge changed the subject to something McDilda had heard rumors about, but knew nothing substantial. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima 2 days earlier. The Kempeitai interrogators wanted everything. How many atomic bombs did America have? How were they made? What cities would be targeted next? McDilda knew that admitting ignorance would result in more torture. So, desperate to survive, he did what any terrified 24-year-old would do. He made up an elaborate, absurdly detailed lie. Drawing on half-remembered high school physics, comic book science fiction, and pure improvisation, McDilda told his interrogators exactly what they thought they wanted to hear. America had over 100 atomic bombs, stockpiled and ready for deployment. They could drop 3 per day. The bombs worked by separating pluses and minuses, positive and negative charges, with lead shields, and when the lead was removed, the resulting reaction produced an explosion of unimaginable power. Tokyo would be the next target, followed by Kyoto and Osaka. Every major Japanese city would be obliterated within weeks. It was complete nonsense. McDilda was conflating atomic bombs with antimatter reactions, a concept from science fiction, not physics. His technical description was laughable to anyone with basic knowledge of atomic fission. But the Kempeitai interrogators weren't nuclear physicists. They were military intelligence officers desperately seeking any information about this incomprehensible new weapon that had just destroyed 2 cities. And McDilda's fabricated testimony, detailed and delivered with the conviction of a man fighting for his life, was exactly what they feared most. Here's the devastating truth that makes McDilda's story so historically significant. In reality, the United States had exactly 0 atomic bombs remaining after Nagasaki. The Manhattan Project had produced enough fissile material for 3 nuclear bombs. Gadget, the first, was detonated in the Trinity test on July 16th. Little Boy and Fat Man had devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The next bomb, nicknamed the Third Shot, wouldn't be ready until around August 19th at the earliest. General Leslie Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, sent a memorandum on August 10th stating that the next bomb should be ready for delivery on the first suitable weather after the 17th or 18th of August. Production estimates suggested possibly 3 bombs in September and hopefully 7 or more by December. But on August 10th, President Truman halted further atomic bombing. According to Vice President Henry Wallace's diary, Truman said that the thought of wiping out another 100,000 people was too horrific. He didn't like the idea of killing, as he said, all those kids. The supreme irony. McDilda's lies claimed America had 100 bombs when the truth was 0. Yet his false testimony was infinitely more effective than the truth would have been, because McDilda's fabricated intelligence confirmed what Japanese leaders now feared, that their scientific calculations about American capabilities had been completely, catastrophically wrong. When McDilda's interrogation report reached the Supreme War Council, it landed like the final crushing blow. War Minister Anamaji, the man who had spoken so poetically about national destruction as a beautiful flower, stood before his colleagues with the weight of absolute defeat in his voice. 1 atomic bomb could destroy 6 square miles, equivalent to 2,000 B-29s, each armed with 300 conventional bombs. The Americans appear to have 100 atomic bombs. They could drop 3 per day. The next target might well be Tokyo. The Japanese military's expertise in nuclear physics had taught them that mass production was impossible. A captured pilot's desperate lies now suggested that the impossible had become terrifyingly real. Expertise was now a prison, and McDilda's fabrications were the key that finally unlocked it. Word of the deadlock reached Emperor Hirohito through informal channels. Prime Minister Suzuki and Foreign Minister Togo met with the emperor privately, describing the impossible situation. The Big Six could not reach a consensus, but Japan's survival hung on the balance. Just before midnight on August 9th, 1945, something happened that hadn't occurred in over 1,000 years in Japanese history. An imperial conference was convened in an underground air raid shelter beneath the imperial palace. The 6 members of the Supreme War Council, along with Baron Kiichiro Hiranuma, president of the Privy Council, knelt in formal positions around a polished table. The scene was unprecedented and surreal. The emperor, small in stature but carrying the weight of divine authority, sat on a small raised platform in front of a folding screen.
In Japanese tradition, the emperor was a living god who remained above earthly decisions, whose role was to embody the nation, not to govern it. But the rules had changed. The atomic bomb had changed everything. The divided Big Six and Hiranuma spoke, presenting their cases. Notably, Army Chief of Staff Uemezu still characterized Soviet entry as merely unfavorable, insisting it didn't invalidate Operation Ketsugo, the plan for defending the home islands. His military analysis was technically correct. The Soviets possessed immense ground power but minimal sea lift capacity, so their threat to actually invade the Japanese home islands was relatively small. What Uemezu couldn't grasp was that conventional military analysis had become meaningless. The atomic bomb had rendered traditional concepts of defense, honor, and strategic calculation obsolete. Hiranuma spoke pointedly of the deterioration of the domestic situation, euphemistic language for the fact that Japan was starving. The blockade had strangled imports. Food supplies were critically low. The civilian population was subsisting on increasingly meager rations. The debate continued past midnight, with no resolution in sight. Finally, at around 2 a.m. on August 10th, Prime Minister Suzuki did something unprecedented. He directly asked Emperor Hirohito to decide between the two positions. The participants later recollected that the emperor's voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with emotion. "I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad, and I have concluded that continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation and the prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. The time has come when we must bear the unbearable and suffer what is unsufferable." In that moment, with those words, Emperor Hirohito ended World War II in the Pacific. The emperor's personal opinion, his saidon or sacred decision, was not technically a command, but in Japanese culture it was understood as such. Prime Minister Suzuki then implored the Supreme Council to accept the emperor's will, transforming imperial opinion into state policy. The deadlock was broken, but not all were convinced. General Korochika Anami returned from that midnight imperial conference a changed man. He had spent his entire life in service to the emperor and the warrior code that defined Japanese military culture for centuries. Now he was being asked to sign a document that would end that culture forever. On August 14th, a second imperial conference accepted the U.S. surrender terms regarding occupation and limits on imperial authority. Hirohito personally decided to end the war, ask those opposed to bear the unbearable, and offered to make a recording of his decision for radio broadcast to the people on August 15th. That afternoon, Anami told his brother-in-law Takashita about the final decision. He asked him to abandon all thought of a military coup. Some junior officers were indeed plotting to seize the imperial palace, destroy the surrender recording, and continue the war. But Anami, despite his opposition to surrender, refused to betray the emperor's expressed will. "Nothing more is to be done," Anami said with finality. That evening, Anami signed the surrender document with the rest of the cabinet. His signature made Japan's capitulation official.
Early on the morning of August 15, 1945, hours before Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast would be transmitted across Japan and the world, General Korochika Amame performed ritual seppuku at his home. The act of seppuku, ritual suicide by disembowelment, was the ultimate expression of the samurai code. It was a death reserved for warriors who had failed in their duty or who faced dishonor. Anami believed that Japan's surrender, however necessary, represented a betrayal of every soldier who had died believing in victory. His suicide notes revealed his tortured mindset. One read, "Confident of the eternity of our fatherland, I give my life to atone for great crimes." Another stated, "I, with my death, humbly apologize to the emperor for the great crime, and repaying my great failures with death." He had earlier told colleagues that he could not bear to live in a defeated Japan. He never acknowledged that the world had fundamentally changed, that the atomic bomb had rendered his warrior philosophy obsolete, that honor and sacrifice meant nothing against weapons that could vaporize cities in microseconds. Anami died as he had lived, according to a code that had been forged in medieval Japan and had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. The atomic age had arrived. The warrior age had ended. And General Anami chose to die with the world he understood, rather than live in the world that had replaced it. At noon on August 15, 1945, millions of Japanese people gathered around radios across the home islands, in occupied territories, on military bases, in factory yards, and city squares. Most had never heard the emperor's voice. The Kyokuin Hoso, the jewel voice broadcast, was unprecedented. Emperors did not speak directly to common people. They existed in semi-divine isolation, their wishes communicated through intermediaries and ministers. But these were not ordinary times. The recording quality was poor, made worse by static and the emperor's use of formal, archaic court Japanese that many listeners struggled to understand. But the message was unmistakable. Japan had surrendered. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, it would not only result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. The atomic bomb had not only ended the war, it had forced an emperor to speak, breaking 1,000 years of imperial silence. Across Japan, reactions varied from grief to relief, from rage to resignation. Some soldiers refused to believe it, insisting it was enemy propaganda. Others wept openly. Civilians who had been preparing for a final apocalyptic battle on their home islands felt a strange mixture of emotions. Defeat, yes, but also the overwhelming realization that they would live. In military installations across the Pacific, Japanese officers faced an impossible choice: obey the emperor's command to surrender or continue fighting for principles they had been told were worth dying for. Most chose obedience. Some chose death. The war was over. After the war, when the full scope of the Manhattan Project was finally revealed, when numbers became public, 130,000 workers, 3 secret cities, more electricity than entire nations, the Japanese military leadership confronted the magnitude of their miscalculation. Admiral Toemu Toyoda, who had so confidently declared on August 6 that the Americans couldn't possibly have many atomic bombs, who had dismissed Hiroshima as a conventional attack, who had based his strategic thinking on Japan's own failed nuclear program, faced a truth that shattered his professional identity. According to post-war accounts, Toyoda spent hours after the surrender staring at photographs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in complete silence.
The devastation captured in those grainy black and white images represented more than military defeat. It represented the absolute failure of expertise itself. He had been right about the science. His calculations about uranium enrichment requirements were accurate. His understanding of the industrial challenges was sound. But he had been catastrophically wrong about American capabilities. The Manhattan Project had accomplished what Japanese scientists, brilliant, educated, thoroughly trained nuclear physicists, had calculated was impossible. The cognitive prison of expertise cost millions of lives and brought Japan to the brink of extinction.
Dr. Yoshio Nishina survived the war, but his life's work did not. In October 1945, after Japan's surrender, Nishina approached the occupying American forces with a request. Could he please continue using his remaining cyclotrons for biological and medical research? The machines had cost years to build, represented cutting-edge scientific capabilities, and could advance peaceful scientific research for decades. Permission was initially granted. Then it was rescinded under direct orders from the Secretary of War. On November 24, 1945, American occupation forces dismantled every cyclotron in Japan. The machines from Riken, Nishina's life's work, Japan's first cyclotrons, scientific instruments that had nothing to do with weapons development, were systematically destroyed. The components were loaded onto barges and thrown into the Gulf of Tokyo. Nishina watched his cyclotron disappear beneath the waves. The machines that had made Japan's father of nuclear physics, that had put Japanese scientists at the forefront of atomic research in the 1930s, that represented thousands of hours of painstaking construction, all gone. It was perhaps the final irony. Japan's atomic research had been so primitive, so far behind the Manhattan Project, that it posed no military threat whatsoever. Yet, the destruction of Nishina's cyclotrons was ordered anyway, driven by fear and the logic of victor's justice. After the war, Nishina became president of Riken and helped salvage the institute from the ashes of defeat. He passed away in 1951, just 6 years after watching Hiroshima burn. Riken later named its Center for Accelerator-Based Science after him, and the Nishina Memorial Foundation gives out awards in his name on an annual basis. But the man who understood atomic physics better than almost anyone in Japan never lived to see his country's post-war scientific renaissance. Numbers are abstractions until they represent human lives. Between 60,000 and 80,000 people died instantly in Hiroshima. Most were civilians, office workers walking to work, children playing in streets, elderly people beginning their morning routines. The heat from the bomb was so intense that some people simply vanished in the explosion, their bodies converted to atomic vapor in microseconds. Over the following 2 to 4 months, the effects of the atomic bombing killed an additional 90,000 to 166,000 people in Hiroshima. They died from radiation sickness, a phenomenon that existed only in theoretical physics papers until August 1945. Their hair fell out, their skin developed lesions, they vomited blood. Their bodies essentially disintegrated from the inside as radiation destroyed their cellular structure at the molecular level. An estimated 35,000 to 40,000 people were killed instantly in Nagasaki. The city's hilly terrain provided some protection, confining the blast and reducing casualties compared to the relatively flat topography of Hiroshima. Over the next 2 to 4 months, an additional 60,000 to 80,000 people died in Nagasaki from burns, injuries, and radiation effects. Total deaths from both atomic bombings, approximately 200,000 to 250,000 human beings. The 4 causes of death were flash burns, immediate burns from heat and light, burns from fires started by the explosion, mechanical injuries from blast effects, and radiation sickness. That 4th category, radiation sickness, was something entirely new in human warfare. Previous weapons killed through kinetic energy, heat or chemical effects. Nuclear weapons killed through subatomic particle bombardment that poisoned victims at the cellular level.
Some survivors, the hibakusha, would carry that cellular damage for the rest of their lives. Rates of leukemia and other cancers among atomic bomb survivors remained elevated for decades. Children born to hibakusha sometimes showed genetic abnormalities from their parents' radiation exposure. The bombs didn't just kill people, they killed futures, possibilities, generations that would never be born. What happened to Marcus MacDilda after his fabricated testimony helped end the war? Unlike the 60,000 to 80,000 people vaporized in Hiroshima, unlike General Anami who chose death over dishonor, unlike the hundreds of thousands who died from radiation sickness, Marcus MacDilda survived. He was held as a prisoner of war until the Japanese surrender. After the war, he returned to the United States and lived a quiet life. He rarely spoke publicly about his experience. In the grand scheme of history, MacDilda's role is a footnote, a bizarre anecdote about a captured pilot whose desperate lies happened to align with Japanese fears at precisely the right moment. But that footnote may have saved lives by accelerating Japan's decision to surrender. The man who knew nothing about atomic bombs delivered testimony that was more effective than 2 actual atomic bombs in breaking Japanese military resistance. It's perhaps the ultimate expression of the cognitive trap. Expertise made Japanese leaders vulnerable to believing elaborate fabrications because those fabrications confirmed what they now feared, that their knowledge had been wrong all along. The cognitive bias that nearly destroyed a nation. Military historians and psychologists have studied the Japanese leadership's decision-making in August 1945 as a textbook case of cognitive bias in high-stakes environments. The specific biases that nearly led to Japan's extinction have names. Confirmation bias. The Japanese leadership rejected evidence that contradicted their existing mental model. When reports of Hiroshima's destruction arrived, they dismissed them because such destruction contradicted their calculations about atomic bomb production, the only accepted evidence that fit their preconceptions. Anchoring bias. The Japanese military planners anchored their assessments to their own failed atomic programs. Their calculations were correct for Japan's industrial capacity, but catastrophically wrong for America's. This anchoring bias prevented them from imagining industrial capabilities beyond their reference point. The Dunning-Kruger effect in reverse. Normally, the Dunning-Kruger effect describes how incompetent people overestimate their abilities, but in Japan's situation, it was the opposite. Highly competent nuclear physicists underestimated what was possible because their expertise taught them the overwhelming difficulties. Expertise became a form of blindness. Group polarization. The Supreme War Council's unanimous consensus requirement created an echo chamber where dissenting views were suppressed. 3 members wanted to continue fighting even after 2 atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the war, demonstrating how group dynamics can amplify dangerous positions. Sunk cost fallacy. Japan had invested 4 years of total war, millions of lives, and its entire national identity in achieving victory. Admitting defeat meant acknowledging that all of those sacrifices had been for nothing. The psychological difficulty of accepting sunk costs nearly led to national extinction. The Supreme War Council's deadlock wasn't irrational, it was hyper-rational in a world where the rules had already changed. They were optimizing for a game that no longer existed. The atomic bomb didn't just end World War II. It ended an entire philosophy of warfare that existed for millennia. Before August 6, 1945, military strategy was fundamentally about territory, resources, and the clash of organized forces. Defense was possible through fortifications, dispersal of forces, and strategic depth. An invasion of Japan would have been hideously costly, but Japanese military planners believed they could make it costly enough to force negotiations. The atomic bomb made all of that obsolete overnight. Fortifications meant nothing when a single bomb could vaporize a city. Dispersal of forces was irrelevant when civilian populations could be targeted directly. Strategic depth was meaningless when bombers could reach any city in Japan from bases in the Marianas.
Japan's military expertise, developed through centuries of samurai culture and decades of modern warfare, became a liability because it was rooted in assumptions that were no longer valid. Today, we face our own technological revolutions that may be rendering current military doctrine obsolete. They are artificial intelligence. Machine learning systems can now process information, identify patterns, and make decisions faster than human commanders. Military leaders who assume warfare will remain human-centric may be as wrong as Japanese officers who assumed warfare would remain about honor and sacrifice. Cyber warfare. A teenager with a laptop can potentially cause more strategic damage than an armored division. Traditional concepts of front lines and rear areas become meaningless when attacks originate from anywhere on the internet. Autonomous weapons. Drones and robotic systems can operate without human control, making decisions about targeting and engagement faster than human reaction time. Commanders who assume they'll always have humans in the loop may be blindsided by adversaries who accept fully autonomous systems. Space-based weapons. Satellites and potential space-to-ground weapons systems could make terrestrial defenses irrelevant. Nations that invest in traditional military capabilities while adversaries dominate space may find themselves in Japan's position in August 1945, possessing expertise that's become obsolete. The warning from 1945 is clear. Professional military expertise can become a prison when the fundamental rules change. The leaders who suffer the most catastrophic defeats are often not the ignorant, but the highly educated who know what's possible, and therefore can't believe it when the impossible happens. 80 years later, the moral question still burns. Were the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki necessary? Those who argue yes point to Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. Intelligence estimates in summer 1945 suggested American casualties could reach 1 million, with Japanese military and civilian deaths in the millions. Every Purple Heart medal manufactured for the invasion has been used in subsequent wars. That's how many casualties the U.S. military expected. They note that Japan's military leadership was divided 3-3, even after 2 atomic bombs and Soviet entry into the war. If it took 2 atomic bombs plus Soviet invasion to produce a deadlock, how many more American and Japanese lives would a conventional invasion have cost? They point out that the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th and 10th, 1945 killed more people than either atomic bomb. Approximately 100,000 civilians burned to death in a single night. The atomic bombs, while horrifying in their instantaneous devastation, were not uniquely cruel in the context of total war that had already killed millions. Those who argue no point to evidence that Japan was already seeking surrender terms through back channels. They note that the Soviet entry into the war may have been more psychologically devastating than the atomic bombs. It eliminated Japan's last hope for a negotiated peace. They argue that the United States could have demonstrated the bomb's power on an unpopulated target first, giving Japan a chance to surrender before vaporizing civilian populations. They question whether dropping the second bomb on Nagasaki just 3 days after Hiroshima gave Japan sufficient time to process what had happened and formulate a response. They note the racist elements in American decision-making. The atomic bombs were ready before Germany's surrender, but there was never serious consideration of using them on German cities. Would the United States have dropped atomic bombs on white European populations, or were these weapons reserved for Asian enemies? The truth is probably somewhere in the complex middle ground. The atomic bombs almost certainly shortened the war and saved American lives. Whether they saved Japanese lives depends on whether you believe Japan would have surrendered without them. A counterfactual we can never truly know. What we can know is what actually happened. 2 cities destroyed, approximately 200,000 people dead, and a cognitive trap that prevented Japanese military leaders from accepting reality until a tortured pilot's lies finally convinced them their expertise had been wrong. In the end, the story of Japan's military leadership in August 1945 is really not about atomic bombs. It's about the dangerous certainty that comes from expertise. The confidence that you understand the rules of the game even when someone else has already changed them forever. Dr. Yoshio Nishima was the world's leading nuclear physicist, a man who had studied with Niels Bohr, who understood atomic fission theory as well as anyone alive. His expertise taught him that building atomic bombs was virtually impossible, given the industrial requirements. He was right for Japan. He was catastrophically wrong about America. Admiral Soemu Toyota was a career naval officer with decades of strategic experience, a man who had commanded fleets and planned campaigns. His military judgment told him that the Americans couldn't possibly have more than 1 or 2 atomic bombs. He was making a logical assessment based on sound principles, and it nearly caused national extinction. General Koretaka Anami was the embodiment of the samurai warrior code, a man who would rather see his entire nation destroyed like a beautiful flower than accept dishonor. His cultural values, refined over centuries, became suicidal in the atomic age. All 3 men were experts. All 3 were highly intelligent, educated, and experienced. And all 3 were catastrophically wrong because their expertise had become a prison. The atomic bomb changed everything, but it took days and Marcus McDilda's absurd lies for Japanese leadership to accept that reality. Today, as we stand on the edge of our own technological revolutions, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, space weaponization, the lesson from August 1945 remains urgently relevant. The greatest danger may not come from ignorance, but from the certainty of experts who know what's impossible, right up until the moment the impossible vaporizes their entire worldview. Sometimes the most dangerous words in any language are, "That's impossible." Our research proves it. Because somewhere, right now, someone might be proving you wrong. And by the time you realize it, entire cities or civilizations might already be burning. What lessons are you taking from this story? Share your thoughts about leadership, technology, and the courage to challenge our own assumptions.